So this is going to be more of a meta-analysis of why do we need God. It's aside from particular stories in specific religions. So it's not necessarily for people who've taken the Shahada or people who believe that Christ died for their sins, for example. It's very specific to particular religions. So it's more of a more of a broader analysis of common answers to these questions. Three broad areas as well. So I'm just going to be talking about three bigger things. Obviously, there's going to be other reasons. I'm sure there'll be people in the comments who come across the video and say, "Well, this is another reason why I need God," and that's cool. Put them in the comments. Something to consider for everyone else to look at and think, yeah, that's a pretty cool reason, apart from the other reasons that Adam's talking about. So the first one, I don't really want to talk about too much because I've covered it on the channel in other videos. I think at least one other video. Quite few and far between on this channel because semi for fun channel, just to get my thoughts out there. Really, just a personal channel. Talk about pretty much what I like. So, but I've covered the whole moral thing before. So why morality is perfectly explicable outside any God framework. So you don't particularly need God. The usual argument is it, but by the way, I'm talking in very broad strokes. So there's probably going to be flaws from the perspective of some people in these observations, but you get my gist when I talk about these things in very broad strokes. But the main thing with this is that God is the basis for morality. So he's the source of good. He or it is the ultimate source for what's good and what's wrong. He's the basis for human moral frameworks, and I just don't think there are other ways of explaining why we have morality. A common sense one, just pulling it out of the air and just thinking about it and just spitballing here, but morality just makes sense generally in terms of having moral frameworks in societies, because that's how you keep a society apart. One way of how you keep a society cohesive. So if you didn't have rules, if you didn't have taboos and a moral framework in particular societies, the society wouldn't last very long, would it? There's reasons why we have prohibitions against theft, against murder, and all the basic stuff. Rape was another thing. I mean, all of these things are pretty universal and transcend particular religions. And yes, there are religious dimensions to them. There are religious justifications in particular societies. That's fairly universal, but they're there for very solid and very practical reasons, I should imagine. So you can easily look at it in a very practical evolutionary term, if you want to use that word. So it just makes sense to have rules because at the end of the day, we're social creatures. None of us survive alone. Even the best of us, if you want to describe it like that, can't survive alone. So we need each other. We need to live in societies, and so therefore you need prohibitions and moral frameworks, if you want to call it that, or systems of rules. You need law and all of that good stuff. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. And those kinds of things have just developed because it makes sense for them to develop, and societies and groups of humans that have these frameworks are going to last a lot longer than those that don't. And that's why the winners in this respect, their descendants still maintain those moral frameworks. Again, I haven't mentioned God. You don't need God to explain that. Second big one, the existential thing. So when you're talking about God explains why we're here, why the universe exists, and all of that, not really. I'm sure many people, many atheists and agnostics and many other people would chime in and say, well, it doesn't explain that much, to be honest. You have the whole God of the gaps thing going on. So there are certain, science does a pretty good job of explaining the universe. Obviously, it doesn't have all the answers, but it has theories and it's based on evidence. And some pretty smart dudes and dudesses over the centuries have figured out a lot of stuff that would take a very long time to go into, but it's pretty substantial that we have explanations about how the universe developed. By the way, a big misconception is that the whole Big Bang, so you have the inflationary event that explains where we are today. So you have the universe expanding rather from an infinitesimally small point, singularity, if you like, and that's the whole Big Bang thing. Note, by the way, that it doesn't actually come up with an ex nihilo explanation. A lot of the time, you could say that's a straw man. So when religious people try and make out that scientists think that we popped out of nothing, if you actually look into it and look into the whole Big Bang thing, you'll see that it's descriptive of a process. It's not necessarily descriptive of the universe's creation. It doesn't describe anything popping into nothing. It describes an event of inflation. So it describes the universe expanding from an infinitesimally small point. I think I'm correct in that, but I'm pretty sure I've covered that before in much earlier videos on this channel. It's a bit of a misnomer to think that scientists, astronomers, if you like, think that everything popped into nothing. It's more of a description of an event and a process. But yeah, we have explanation for a lot of things to do with the universe. And also, I wouldn't necessarily assume that the universe had a beginning. I think, in fact, it's just my personal opinion, but I would suggest that maybe it doesn't have a beginning. I think the system itself probably doesn't have a beginning. What I mean by the system is the whole universe itself, or the multiverse, whatever, if you want to scale it up, if you like. I've looked into this before as well, and I've got my own argument on why I think the universe is probably cyclical. It seems to me that the process that's described, at least my limited understanding of it, the whole Big Bang thing and inflation, suggests that there's always been a universe in one form or another, that the system itself is cyclical and infinite in that respect. And we think that because we see within the system that things transfer into one thing or another. So the whole thing with the universe is that you have states of energy and matter, don't you? And that those states of energy and matter transfer from one form to another. So when I die, for example, the atoms that make up my body and the chemicals and everything about it will become other things and other parts, but the things in and of themselves won't be destroyed. So it's a transfer of energy and matter, isn't it? And within that system, of course, there are beginnings and ends, and it's hard for us human beings to think outside of that because that's what we're used to. But then I wouldn't necessarily say that the system itself as a whole, so you're talking about the universe as a whole, imagine it as this sort of globular thing. I don't think you could necessarily assume it has a beginning. We think that, as I've said, because everything within it seems to have a beginning and end. Different states, everything's in flux. But yeah, so that's a point I would put to you. Just an interesting point, perhaps, that we shouldn't necessarily assume a beginning. And even if we do assume a beginning, God isn't particularly helpful, and we've got explanations for a lot of it anyway. So yeah, just another consideration. And the final big one for me, I don't think I've talked about this one too much on the channel, but there's the whole spiritual thing, isn't it? And I respect that. I mean, I think it's another big misconception that atheists and agnostics are. I think everyone's strictly an agnostic. If you ever read that book, The God Delusion, there's a scale, isn't there? You can be on the extreme end of the scale, but everyone's strictly agnostic. But I think even people like me and other people who are very skeptical about a divine being or any religious take on the whole thing, even we can still have. It depends on you use whatever colourful words you like, but you can still have meaning in your life. I'm using very broad terms here, but you get the gist of what I'm talking about. So spirituality have a deeper meaning to your life. How can you have that without a God? Well, I can use myself as an example, but I have profound meaning to my life, and I don't believe in a God. I think you can get that from all sorts of things, but chiefly I would suggest in your connections with other people and other creatures, you can derive immense meaning and satisfaction in your life, and there's no God involved in that either. It's more like being part of something larger than yourself. So again, it doubles back to what we were talking about earlier with the whole moral thing. So we're social animals. We're always going to live in groups, and we're always going to rely on each other. And I think you can derive immense meaning through the connections that we have, and that gives you a very deep spiritual sense in your life without any God or anything like that. Just look at like occupations and things like that. So millions and millions of people around the world. You just think about like a doctor, someone who studies for years to hone their craft, and then they use that to help hundreds or thousands of people over their career. Care worker. Imagine how much meaning that gives your life to help vulnerable people, to go into their homes and provide comfort, maybe a laugh, maybe you're the only person that they see all day, that kind of thing. I know a couple of care workers from my family, and yeah, everyone has hard days, but in these different professions. But I expect a lot of these people have a very deep meaning into their life because of what they do and their connections with other people. Again, all of that not necessarily derived from a god, is it? It's not relevant. So yeah, I just wanted to do three areas, common areas. People say, "Oh well, if you don't believe in God, you don't have any meaning in your life. We don't have any moral basis, and we don't have an existential basis." God apparently explains all of that, and we don't need to look into it anymore. Bit of a sly straw man in there, although most people won't necessarily word it that way. But yeah, just three general areas today. Again, I'm sure there's more. I'm not perfect. I don't claim to be all knowing. But yeah, just a fairly quick one today, and I'll see you in the next one.